Okay, second presentation is China. This is a different video that I did. At about the same time I'm seeing changes in markets moving to Texas, I see China. And I think, okay, is this also part of the global reset and the de-emphasis of London as potentially the granddaddy of all the gold markets? So in Reuters, it was reported that China would draw foreign investors into commodities future trading. Now, China's always had a commodities markets, at least for the last 30 years, but it was relegated to iron, oil futures, and a few other things. It was small market, but they're expanding it greatly. So it says here, China will launch more futures contracts, including a shipping futures contract. Now, we all have seen what's happened to containers and shipping rates and backups in the shipping industry. And this seems very timely to that, in that China may want to have some price control power and influence in the overall shipping industry, maybe to also facilitate more shipments into their markets as well by offering those shipping futures trade. Accelerate efforts to bring in more overseas investors to trade in its future market, the State Council or Cabinet said on Friday. China will launch more futures contracts, including shipping futures contract. They will establish an international non-dollar yuan-denominated commodity futures market, it said in a statement promoting trade and investment as free trade zones. So again, de-dollarization. The de-dollarization in the oil trade, basically the death of the petrodollar, I think, has already happened. You see the agreements with Saudi Arabia, political agreements between Russia with Saudi Arabia and Nigeria. You see the Belt and Road Initiative with China. Now you've got a alternative currency, fully open, fully developed commodities market being developed in China. It says, with the country gradually opening up more commodities derivative contracts to overseas participants or trading, China will accelerate the introduction of overseas traders, build an international commodity futures market priced and settled in renminbi, and develop widely representative futures prices that domestic and foreign traders will recognize and participate in. Also reported in FX Street, main takeaways will accelerate and bring in overseas investors into domestic futures trading, so China is now open for business. We'll launch more futures contracts, including shipping futures, and we'll launch pilot schemes for intellectual property rights securitization. Anybody, I'm curious as to what this means, and I don't know. Anybody know why China would want to be a player in intellectual property rights securitization? Does this have anything to do with their smart contracts and their digital currency system, perhaps? Anybody have any thoughts on that? I know there are people that understand that market better than I do. Yes?
Just to say it's kind of obvious. I mean, they don't like our intellectual property rights security system. You know, so yeah, it's like just we're going to get those U.S. folks from Austin and New York City, and they can sit under our system for a while. And they're the largest gold producer, and they will be for a long time. So they're just trying to do what we did 100 years ago.
I was going to say, it's kind of rich to,
Somebody's watching it.
they've been stealing our intellectual property for the last 30 years.
Of course they have.
Now they're saying, okay, we're going to block. Now that we're starting to produce our own intellectual property. So
Yeah.
If I have time, I'll talk about the case of Nortel and how 𝙂𝙊 is basically Nortel 2.0. I don't know if I'll have time to talk about that, but the Chinese military invaded Nortel's systems, took all their intellectual property and built 𝙂𝙊. So 𝙂𝙊 was what Nortel used to be, using the same technology in engineering. Okay, the China Security Regulatory Commission, CSRC, the country's top securities regulator, said Friday it will further expand the scope of specific futures varieties and enhance participation of overseas traders and support financial institutions, so on and so forth. And of course, who is the first trader that's going to be doing commodities there is JP Morgan. The top securities regulator in June granted approval, allowing JP Morgan Futures Co. to become the country's first wholly foreign-owned futures trading firm. Is that a surprise to anybody sitting in this room? This year marks the 30th anniversary of the launch of the Chinese futures market. At the end of November, funds in Chinese future market had exceeded 855.95 billion yuan, which is about 130.5 billion US dollars, up 55.2% on the year. So they've already got traders in the markets and increasing, volume. Meanwhile, the turnover in China's future market reached 382.5 trillion yuan, up 45.5% year on year in November. The commodities future available to international investors has been operating smoothly, such as crude oil and iron ore futures, which they've had, I guess, for those 30 years. According to International Energy Exchange in Shanghai, a unit of the Shanghai Futures Exchange, it is registered 52 overseas agencies, mainly trading from Hong Kong, Singapore, Britain. That's an interesting one. The Republic of Korea and Japan, which serve customers from Britain, Australia, Switzerland, Singapore, Cyprus, Seychelles, as well as Hong Kong and Taiwan. So Britain got involved in financing the Belt and Road Initiative, and now they're involved in Chinese futures market. So they're pretty smart. They know what's happening in China. They know that China's rising as a power, and they're going to put their money with the lead horse in the race, I guess. 𝙎𝙊𝙇𝙑𝙊𝙎, CEO of JP Morgan Futures Co., said as China continues to open its futures market and launch new varieties of products, the country's market will play more of an important role in the world market, and more overseas investors will join in. So references there. I think I'm done with that presentation. So any questions on China? Yes?
Henry, your talk on Texas, I appreciate Texas always thinks big. I can see no reason. You gave a lot of reasons why Texas would like to have those markets move down there. You gave very few reasons as to why those markets would really want to move out of New York and go down there.
I think the taxation issue was a reason given, but I think there's another reason. I don't think it's a strong enough reason. But there's a lot of smoke around that, and maybe it's just a threat, but I don't necessarily think it is.
There's a lot of smoke around a lot of things that come out of Texas.
Yeah. So what if China connects 73% of the world's economies together in the Belt and Road Initiative, and they have more loans in yuan than, say, our dollar-based loans? Would companies want to trade in their markets to facilitate getting involved in all of those billions and potentially?
As long as you can make money, they'll trade there. And as soon as they can't make money anymore, they'll pull out just as fast as they went in.
But how often does that change, though? When's the last time anybody pulled out of New York or London?
It can change pretty damn fast. I was in China.
100 years? 200 years? How long have London and New York been operating as financial markets?
China was in chaos and incredible
Yeah.
poverty in the mid-1980s when I went in. And they've had this
Yeah.
revolution in their economy right now. And it can go down just as fast as it went up.
So who's been a dominant superpower in the world stage longer, China or the United States? How many thousands of years was China the predominant power in the Eastern Hemisphere? Before anybody ever, before we met the Native Americans in the United States and formed a government. So I think if you're thinking the last 20 or 30 years, I understand your viewpoint. If you're thinking the last 5,000 years, I think I disagree with you. I would say be careful of discounting the rise in China. There's a lot of power building in China. And it's being built with international money. It's not just being built with Chinese yuan. There are major global banks. There are big players in China. Yes? Right. They do. They have a succession of 5-year plans, but I don't think, my personal opinion is I don't think the Communist Party ever went away. I think they just kind of went into the background. And they allowed capitalism to flourish in sort of in agreement with the communists or whoever the ruling party is. If you look at Nortel, for example, which is the big Canadian telecom, and I gave this presentation about 8 years ago because I worked in cybersecurity for Verizon. So I gave this presentation at Verizon. Nortel, when they collapsed, were the size of what Verizon, AT&T are combined today. It was about, in today's dollar, about half $1 trillion company. And what had happened was the Chinese had gone in and stolen all of Nortel's intellectual property. And their lead security guy, his name's Brian, I forget his last name, was on MSNBC documenting all the logs of them stealing everything. And he went to the CEO of Nortel. And the CEO refused to believe it, even though he had the logs and the IP addresses. And he knew exactly, he mapped out exactly the building in which the hackers in China were stealing the information from. And he had satellite photos. And the CEO didn't do anything about it because this is back before cybersecurity became a big industry like it is now. And what happens, they took all that, they gave it to 𝙂𝙊 because the Chinese military has offices in the 𝙂𝙊 building. They handed it over to 𝙂𝙊, and this is documented in Canadian newspapers as they did the research. And they built 𝙂𝙊 up. 𝙂𝙊 went over to Canada and started taking their business. So China has been doing this to, I anticipate, US and Canadian and other Western countries for a very long time. The original stealing of data from Nortel, I think, happened in the mid-90s, and it went for about 10 years. He said he had 10 years of logs showing China had been stealing everything they've been developing for 10 years before they found it. So, yes, go ahead.
I think the U.S. has a really big problem
Mhm.
We, 50% of GDP is now government expenditure.
Mhm.
We are a centrally planned economy. Free market capitalism has not been around for a long time.
No.
So we're in a distorted situation. We haven't got the advantages of either.
We're looking from a lens of a couple of centuries in modern history. We're not looking at a very, very, very long-term lens. And I think some of the things here are speaking more to a long-term change in world geopolitics and world trade and world finance. I do agree with this gentleman that the overzealousness of the Chinese system of government probably will harm their advance in both the Belt and Road Initiative and also opening up their derivatives markets, but I think they're pretty smart. I mean, China learned from the Western nations, stole a lot of its technology, stole its processes, invited companies in and basically took it. And they built quite an impressive economy, and it's going along full steam. Now they have debt problems. Some of their state-owned entities are having a lot of issues. You have the Evergrande situation, the potential for maybe systemic debt contagion. But they're smart. They adapt very quickly, and I would not underestimate them. Any other questions on either China or Texas? Yeah, so I kind of went in. I touched on it, yeah. So Nortel was this huge Canadian telecom, and the story around Nortel was they just made bad business decisions and they collapsed. So when I got first involved in cybersecurity about 10 years ago, I was doing research for Verizon on potential threats to the company. And I was the lead auditor for network and security for the company. So I do audit reports, and they go to executive management, and we would make recommendations on how to facilitate cybersecurity, because we knew the Chinese were coming in. We just didn't know how. And we had the logs too, but we didn't have the systems developed to prevent it. So I did a lot of research, and I found the Nortel example, and basically, back in that day, the telecom, it's funny because the telecoms run the internet, right? But they didn't have their own security. We didn't have security. And the Chinese figured this out. So as soon as the internet basically got up and running, they started hacking all the telecom companies and taking their intellectual property. And not only that, if you think about it, most of the government agencies have assets in telecom data centers, like Verizon, AT&T, Windstream, all of the American telecom companies, and all of the traffic flow comes across our transport networks. So the Chinese are sitting there on the American telecom networks. They're seeing everything. They're seeing intellectual property flow from any industry in the United States. They're seeing they can get into public universities. In fact, I went to Black Hat in Las Vegas a few years ago, and there was a report, I think it was by McAfee and Intel, talking about what the Chinese were targeting. And a few years ago, it was all the universities. They were stealing all of our research and stealing all of our presentations, all the PhD papers. And they do it a lot through the telecoms, but they also invade, university websites and things. And in any case, in the case of Nortel, they stole all of their engineering diagrams, and it took them about 10 years. It took 10 years to steal it and reverse engineer it, but they reverse engineer it, built the product. And it was funny, one of the Canadian newspapers reported on that and said, when Huawei approached Canadian companies as a competitor for Nortel and providing service, they had a manual which had Nortel on it that they handed over to that company and said, well, this is how you use our product. They didn't bother even putting their own logo on it and changing it, So they had literally just taken Nortel, stolen their property, went and underpriced them, took all of their customers, and Nortel collapsed. And that, again, in today's dollar, was about a $500 billion company at the time. It was like 33% of the Canadian stock market. Nortel was when it collapsed. It was huge. It was bigger than anything you'll see in the U.S. stock market. Bigger effect than if Apple collapsed tomorrow. Yes.
I got a question. This might not be, and I may not know what I'm talking about. What's
Sure.
happened to the Japanese economy? Why aren't they going to sit back and say, are they going to sit back and look at this and say, oh, are you kidding me? Is China really going to take over? Is the Japanese are as strong as they were, and now they just kind of sit back and let this all happen?
I'm not an expert on Japan. I think there are people who probably could comment on that a little bit better. My understanding is they have huge debt issues and demographic issues, which may prevent them from becoming as strong a player in the financial markets, but I am no expert on Japan, so I may defer to somebody else to answer that question. Oh, one other interesting thing that happened, I saw in the news last week, we have the Five Eyes Intelligence Network, which is Japan, US, Australia, who are the other two? Is it Canada and Britain? Well, the BRIC nations just signed their own agreement. So not only did they have trade in commodities markets and the Belt and Road Initiative, they also signed their own intelligence agreement. And what's interesting is India has put up more satellites, spy satellites and communication satellites in the last few years than like almost all of the other nations combined. And so they've built this huge intelligence network in space, and they've signed an intelligence sharing agreement. So now you see not only the polarization of trade between the BRIC nations and the traditional Western nations, but you see it in these deals that Russia and China are doing with these countries for energy, and you're seeing it in intelligence sharing. So we're definitely seeing, you know, the Axis and allies, if you will, being reformed, just in a different format than we saw before. Any other questions? All right, thank you everybody so much for attending this. Somebody's next, I don't know who's next, I would introduce him, but appreciate all of your questions. I'll be in the workshop room here, I want to say at 10:40, and I'll be doing a session on valuing mining stocks. We'll be using some different accounting methods to value mining stocks, and we're going to talk about doing that in a down commodity cycle. Thank you everybody, appreciate it.